Distinguished guest, welcome to Slovenia again. It's our pleasure to have you here. I think our speakers pointed out already four areas that we would like to have discussion today. And these four areas are the role of NATO from the historical point of view. Of course, where is NATO today, where it was 15 years ago, and of course, where we are heading. NATO and Slovenia, that's always question in Slovenia, and I believe all NATO nations. What is NATO, what NATO means, and of course what NATO means for our Slovenian forces, our military, and of course also including the civilian portion that is part of NATO. Many times you can hear in NATO is military and not other portion of our civilian lives. Of course, I won't focus now on completely on past. But maybe it's always, because my daughter is always saying, if you focus on your past, you lose your future. But however, Lord Robertson, I would kindly ask you to give us some brief overview of NATO and 70 years of success story. Where was NATO 70 years ago, 15 years ago when we entering NATO, and where is NATO today? Please, Lord Robertson.
Thank you very much first of all for the invitation to come here and to be given the opportunity of congratulating Slovenia on these 15 years as part of the alliance, and it's nice to be back here and to be able to give you that commendation and to first of all emphasize that I am no longer the Secretary General of NATO. I have no responsibility whatsoever for NATO. And still less for the United Kingdom government and whatever is happening there today or tomorrow or even yesterday. Although my Apple Watch did tell me a few minutes ago of what the Prime Minister actually asked for, which I think puts me in a very small category. So I speak simply as an ordinary citizen, but with a bit of a past. I see some faces in the audience. Foreign Minister Ruppel, they say death is like watching your past flashing before your eyes. And of course, Foreign Minister Ruppel was a record breaker in terms of foreign minister at the time that I was there as well. But I recall coming to Ljubljana for the very first time, and there was a guard of honor. I'm not used to guards of honor. Today was an unfamiliar experience, but at that time it was normal. And at the end of the guard of honor, as the Prime Minister took me down the guard of honor, was a demonstration against NATO. Huge banners were being paraded, and I pointed out to the Prime Minister at the time that it would be more useful for them getting over their message if the language of the banners had actually been in English, and I might have understood what they were saying. But when I did the press conference afterwards, and this is the point I would like to emphasize, is they asked me, was I not embarrassed or worried by the fact that there were people demonstrating against NATO? And I said, absolutely not. It fills my heart with joy that they're out there in the streets demonstrating, because had it not been for NATO, they would not be able to do so, and they would have been locked up as a consequence of doing it. And I think that's what we need to remember, and what we need to remind the new generation about. That NATO is a defensive alliance that stood for all of these years against the tyranny that half of Europe experienced at the time, and that represented something fundamental to all of our lives. So freedom is not an abstract concept for people in this part of the world, because the lack of it was something that was real and impinged on their lives as a whole. So 70 years of NATO is 70 years of a defensive alliance, partly military, and its strength internally allowed it to prevail during all of these years, but also a political alliance of values of free speech, of free press, of a mixed economy, of the rule of law, the differentiation of the church and state. These are the values that NATO has stood for, and which has been its towering strength during all of that period of time. So when the Soviet Union disappeared and the new world beckoned, NATO was still there, adapting to the new circumstances and helping the countries that used to be behind the Iron Curtain to move from command economies to mixed economies, from dictatorship to pluralism, you know, and to the values of the West, and it therefore adapted in that way. And I came on the scene in 1999 after the second Balkan conflict, the residue of Bosnia there, where NATO had intervened for the first time militarily since it was created. The first shots in anger of this old military alliance were not against the Soviet Union, but they were to protect people in Bosnia and Herzegovina at that time. Immediately after Kosovo, where I was defense minister, and then looking at a very different world. So the invocation of Article 5 on the 11th of September 2001 was, you know, one of the most significant items in my life. It was a day of real drama following on a day when the world changed forever, and where the alliance expressed to the world, and especially to the United States of America, that this was not some gathering of people who simply assembled together in order to exchange talk or to exercise, but we were real and tangible, and we were an alliance that said one for all and all for one as well, to do with that. So during my period of time, if we're going to talk about the past, we were strong, we were resolute, we took action in Bosnia, in Kosovo, in what was then Macedonia, in Afghanistan. In all of these areas, NATO was involved and invoked in order to protect the values that we stood for, and that is what it needs to be in the future as well. So Slovenia, having joined NATO in 2004, has been a loyal, strong ally and able to contribute to the operations that we saw on the television there. But it has to do more in the future, and it has to live up to the commitments that have voluntarily been taken on by all of the NATO countries. Because I say this very solemnly and as my final comment, President Donald Trump has delivered one very serious message to the Europeans and done us a great favor as well, because he shattered the complacency that up to now has existed, that America would always be there. In whatever circumstance, America was always going to be there, and that allowed, in that complacency, decisions by European governments to be taken that did not allow them to fulfill the obligations to their own self-defense and to the defense of the alliance. And therefore now we live in a world where we cannot automatically take the United States for granted. And therefore the increasing defense expenditure that NATO calls on its allies to do, that defense investment is not there simply in order to justify our position vis-a-vis Donald Trump, but in the national self-interest of all of the allied countries. And I hope that's a lesson that I can get over today, purely as a citizen with a past, but somebody who also believes in a NATO of the future.
Lord, thank you very much for that words. Now, can we hear how the Slovenia feel the approach to NATO, and our first ambassador, permanent representative to NATO, was Ambassador Šinkovec. Maybe if you can give us insights, how did you feel that?
Well, thank you very much, Chair, and really it's good to have you back here, George, after quite a while. And I wanted also to thank the big band, because I had them play in my garden 13 years ago. They had a wonderful concert there. And I think when they sang this tra-ta-ta thing, I mean, NATO is fun. It's not so as serious as it sometimes sounds. But seeing my minister here, I have to do a little small print that the views I'm expressing are my own only. And yeah, thank you. I think the smile says that I can do whatever I want to do. So let me start with a bit of a history first, as I was asked, and I will use 5 minutes of your time today. And I wanted to start with some quote, and then I chose a quote not from any Secretary General of NATO, but from the Oscar ceremony of Lady Gaga. If you have a dream, fight for it. Not very original, but yeah, she's pretty influential, as they say. My dream was, and I first expressed it in the Slovenian parliament back in 1991, before our recognition, for Slovenia to be in NATO. I wanted Slovenia to sit at the top table in the alliance of values that won the Cold War. A year after the 1997 NATO summit fiasco, I was sent by the late Prime Minister Drnovšek to Brussels, and then got stuck there for about 8 years as ambassador to NATO and later on as the Perm Rep on the North Atlantic Council, NAC in short. It was not easy to shape up Slovenia in the 5 accession chapters: political, economic, military, security, and legal, even though we actually had already become a de facto ally during NATO's Allied Force campaign over Serbia. Don't forget that, by providing both our airspace and intelligence. Still, we managed. I believe we became a good rookie ally. We played a constructive role in the consensus-based NAC decision-making. We decided to send troops to Afghanistan, Kosovo, and Iraq. We opted for NATO's no-cost air policing of our airspace. We became even a co-owner of 3 giant C-17 strategic transport airplanes that nobody knows anything about in Slovenia. We entered the air-ground surveillance scheme, and we managed to then opt for fully professional armed forces, and we paid almost zilch for defense in professional in comparison with what we had to pay for the so-called defense of the former federation. When I left NATO in October 2006, Slovenia had more troops in NATO's operations than any other ally on the per capita, of course. Then the US put all their troops under ISAF control, so we were number 2 in this respect. But where are we now? Where do we go from here? I'll be very personal again. I presented back in 2005 a sort of science fiction sounding scenario at the NAC Away Day discussion talking about NATO in 2015. Among the elements threatening us that I predicted were the following: 1, spread of more violent Islamic extremism; 2, mass migrations; 3, militarization of China; 4, rise of authoritarian Russia; 5, effects of global warming. That was 14 years ago, and where are we now? As I see it, 70 years ago, the democratic community probably faced a less uncertain security environment than we do today. Even the threats mostly in our minds today could be just small fry in comparison with the magnitude of the threats we could and probably will face in the future. Perhaps at this very moment, the public perception is that we do not need NATO that bad. But defense planning is not something that produces results overnight. It takes years. And coalitions of the willing are not the right answer to long-term threats. We need to maintain and develop the alliance. We need to train it in operations and find new ways of defending ourselves against new threats. NATO needs to acquire maximum awareness. It needs to be able to act truly globally. It needs to be more agile and flexible. It needs more common assets and more common funding. I proposed the formula a decade ago that every NATO ally should be able to have permanently 200 troops per million population in missions and operations. Slovenia has proven that that is possible. To gain a better image and more public support, I believe NATO should get involved very visibly in more natural and man-made disaster relief. Finally, there's no NATO without nuclear deterrent. And there's no NATO without consensus decision-making and Article 5. Also, NATO and the EU need to overcome the still pathetic relationship between the two and work together much better. Being personally a PESCO and defense unit skeptic, I would hope that the EU could prove itself at least in successful protection of EU's external borders against irregular migrations and trafficking of people, arms, and drugs. But there's no chance at all that Europe could replace NATO in collective defense as I see it. And the current rocky relationship with our largest ally should be a wake-up call for the Europeans. We need to pay for our own defense, and sensibly not just for salaries of troops in the barracks and retirement, but for up-to-date capabilities, training and participation in missions and operations. The US will be back fully in the fold in no time, I expect. But let us walk the walk, not just talk the talk. And finally, a few, maybe 5 sentences on Slovenia, as I was asked. First, Slovenia needs a small force of well-trained, well-equipped troops that we can rotate and send wherever we decide to. Let us have more teeth and less tail. I feel we have disregarded tactical air transport capabilities, and being a maritime nation, we are very shy proving this reality in our seas and the high seas. Secondly, can we be proud of evading paying our fair share for our own defense that we have been promising for ages? Does one for all for one mean that someone else has to step up if we do not deliver? Let's not be complacent, as Lord Robertson said. Third, membership in NATO ensures that there will be no militarization of our society as we have known in the past. It also keeps us sitting at the top global table. Do we want to crawl back into obscurity? 4, to me personally, NATO, just like the EU, is not a religion. It's not a burden. It's a tool for maintaining our territorial integrity, security, peace, development, prosperity, freedom, rule of law, well, our way of life. Finally, in our global civilization of clashes, there will be no permanent Euro-Atlantic value of peace if we do not continuously work on maintaining it. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. So I would like to pass the word to Assistant Secretary General, Mr. Grant. Many challenges. So it was mentioned once NATO was strong and decisive, and maybe we are wondering if we are still decisive and strong. We have many new challenges that it's coming in, and it's hybrid threats, cybercrime, migration, Brexit, INF suspension, and so on and so on and so on. Open door policy, for example. Can you give us thoughts? What is the future? Where we are going and where we are now, and what are our challenges, and especially for you as a young generation being in NATO, and it's very interesting to be as a young in NATO on such an important position. Please.
Thank you very much. Let me first wish, of course, a wonderful 15th anniversary to Slovenia in NATO. I think we are these days marking a lot of these anniversaries of the enlargement, and it shows how much enlargement is not only something that made sense at the time, but that is still also very vivid for the nations concerned and for the alliance itself. And it shows how much it has brought to the discussions at NATO, to the NAC table today, and it's very, very interesting to see it from the inside also, the dynamic with being 29 and soon 30 when North Macedonia joins hopefully later this year. I would say, if you allow me, add one personal anecdote to this event, because it's, for me, also an anniversary with both Slovenia and NATO. In 2009, in this very building, I was invited to give a speech for a seminar on the strategic concept that was hosted by Slovenia then. And this was the start of a sort of an affair between me and NATO, because Madeleine Albright, who was chairing that group, sort of decided to hire me to support the group doing the strategic concept, which later led me to work more and more on NATO. So it's very, very special to be here today. Looking at the at NATO today, I think it's very important and sometimes slightly overlooked to recognize that we've really entered what I would call a sort of third phase in NATO history. It has been recalled very well by Lord Robertson. We really changed over time. And there was, of course, the Cold War era. There was a pretty long 25-year moment from the end of the Cold War to 2014, more or less, which was about enlargement, which was about establishing further partnership, which was about crisis management in the Balkans, in Afghanistan, in Libya. with lots of very successful operations, lots of very successful commitments, which of course culminated with the largest operation in NATO's history in Afghanistan. Since 2014, and I was involved in some of the preparation for the Wales Summit, in the early days, about a year before the Wales Summit, there was a question on what is our message as our presence in Afghanistan is going down, as NATO's commitment to crisis management is de facto declining, at least in numbers, if not in intensity. What happened then with the events in Ukraine served as a very clear wake-up call for this alliance, that we had to be serious, and I would say serious again when it comes to a collective defense, that we had maybe left this issue a bit aside based on the assessment that as the President recalled when you joined the alliance, that we were in an environment that was much more stable and much more reassuring. And that led from the Wales Summit to the Warsaw Summit to the Brussels Summit, so 2014, 2016, 2018, to a number of decisions which have significantly transformed the alliance in order to address those challenges in a sort of 360 degrees way. So because this is of course about the Russian behavior in our neighborhood, but this is also about a more wider sort of arc of instability that creates risks associated with terrorism, with cyber, with hybrid threats, not only coming from Russia. So we've taken a series of very deliberate decisions to enhance our deterrence and defense posture very significantly. We agreed to invest more in defense, and I'll come back to that because that is a very significant step that very much preceded any the election of President Trump, and this was a collective decision by all the allies to really go into reinvest in defense by the 2% of GDP target, and also 20% in investment in new capabilities. We also decided to deploy troops on the eastern flank of the alliance for the first time. So 5,000 of these, including many of the newer allies are involved in those missions and hence forward presence and tailored forward presence. We decided to increase the readiness of our forces. This is extraordinarily demanding for the military of the alliance, but this is something that we are really working on and we continue to work on. At the last summit, we had a NATO readiness initiative, which is really a call for all the allies to contribute to have high readiness forces. We've developed a 360 degrees approach to security to cope with this broad spectrum of challenges and threats. And we really are trying to stay relevant and fit for purpose, which meant an adapted NATO command structure. For the first time since the end of the Cold War, we are increasing the numbers and adapting very significantly our command structure, not to shrink it, but to make it more relevant and efficient in terms of logistics by creating a joint force command for the Atlantic again. I mean, all these things are extraordinarily significant, even if we sometimes don't really pay attention to those very concrete developments. We're also working more with the European Union, and we've developed 74 areas of cooperation there. So all of these things are happening. We've recognized cyber as a domain of operation. And now we have a number of allies that have committed to provide cyber effects to for the alliance. So just to say that this is a living alliance that is really working on its relevance. Let me end with a word on burden sharing, because of course this is something that is very much in our debates and in our minds in Brussels at NATO headquarters. Let me stress, as my predecessors have said, that this is not about pleasing the United States or another ally, or even about pleasing NATO. This is about our security. So when we committed to that, this is really about this, each nation's individual security and our collective security. This is way below some of the numbers that we were quite standard during the Cold War era. So this is by no means sort of a return to an arms race or a Cold War posture. The standard figure in Western Europe during the Cold War were between 3 and 4%. So this is not what we are trying to do. And of course, this is not only about money, this is about, as we say, the 3 C's, cash, capabilities, and contributions, and the fact that there are contributions to operation is very meaningful in this regard. So this, in this strategic concept, reaching the 2% is really very important. It's a key priority for the Secretary General and a pledge that all allies are committed for. So in this context, just in wrapping up, let me say that, of course, Slovenia takes its share of this overall burden. We know it's a committed ally. The figures and the numbers in terms of commitments to NATO operations and missions have been stated today. And the role in KFOR in the Western Balkans is really critical for the success of the alliance in building stability for your neighboring regions. But it's also important to be present in Latvia, in enhanced forward presence, to be part of the resolute support mission in Afghanistan. So all of this is very much part of a package, I would argue. So as we mark this anniversary, let me stress in closing with 2 things. First of all, a belief that I think is very visible across the board when we have our discussions at NATO headquarters for ministerials, for summits, that this alliance is and remains vital for security, maybe more so than 10 or 15 years ago. And secondly, that it is relevant to address some of those security challenges of the futures, those we know, and those we don't necessarily know as we speak. And that has been one of the critical abilities of the alliance for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that insights, and definitely we are really committed, and we believe that NATO is still strong and decisive, and we are showing that every day. Brigadier Forlan, you were part of military from the very beginning, and you are also, as I know, responsible for building standards to reach building standards for our Slovenian military to reach the NATO standards. Can you give us insights what that standards meant for us, what NATO meant for us, and all the experience that we get from the operations abroad?
Thank you very much. Yes. Well, my intent is to share some thoughts about why NATO membership is important from the military perspective. But first, am I allowed to use just a minute to explain this really wonderful and specific situation? Once I was commander, and I commanded brigade, and Mr. Secretary was a battalion commander, so at that point I was his chief, and he deployed to Afghanistan. Later I deployed or performed mission in Joint Force Command Naples, and he was my chief as a chief of the general staff. So it's quite a pressure, because whatever I say about the military importance and the military role within NATO, I know that he will, I compete with his view, but then it's even worse, because there I see Brigadier General Shkrbinc. He commanded the largest contingent ever deployed outside Slovenia. It was a battalion in KFOR, and then later worked in NATO IMS. And then his Brigadier Pugraitz, he was a deputy commander of KFOR troops. Besides the commanding duty in NATO headquarters, Skopje, this was the highest position, I believe, deployed. And then General Steiner, he published a book about the military transformation and the influence of NATO on this transformation. So, and not to mention some other commanders of contingents, not a lot of pressure. So what is really mean this for the Slovenian armed forces? Well, simply said, it's, you know, we are the part of the most modern, most experienced, most knowledgeable armed forces, I can say, globally. So this, being part of this, they directly influence the quality of armed forces, Slovenian armed forces. And when we speak about quality, we in the military, we discuss readiness and military effectiveness in conducting operations. For those of you that understand football, this is like playing in the Champions League. And there are many aspects what comes from NATO membership, for the armed forces, definitely is opportunity to learn of all of these militaries and to train together, to develop interoperability skills that when we really need to do our main job, which is war fighting, that we can perform effectively and all together. So the NATO training exercise provide this close to real environment, and also NATO operations. There's an environment that prepares us for something we may experience in the future. And along the way, we built a confidence, self-confidence that we can go along these armed forces. I believe that politicians can be more confident that the military they control is capable to perform operations because they are trained together with all these more developed and the most modern troops. And I believe also our citizens can be confident since we can do our main job together with others that we are okay. And these exercises, operations, and of course doctrine, procedures and everything else prepares us for the real operations, which are combat operations, what we are intended for. And here we satisfied within NATO, I would say, professional imperative. What does this mean? Military profession is like no other profession because of some specifics, how we do our job, and of course, for high probability that we can die along the way. But it's also a profession that really we don't have a lot of chance to practice our main job in reality, except you are in American, British, French, Russian, Syrian, and some other militaries that are involved in conflicts. Most of us, or generations, maybe can go through the whole career. They will not experience combat operations. So one day when you're called up to perform this, you really try to get everything from the training, everything from the knowledge and so on. So that's why it's important to be part of NATO operations, NATO exercises, and so on. It's like being surgeon that one day you are on the table and you ask your surgeon, well, have you ever performed this operation? And they say, well, I have performed a lot of training, but actually never opened the body. So, well, then you can be quite uncomfortable. But if he or she explains to you, but look, I performed training with the best surgeons in the world, well, this is much more easier, but still uncomfortable. But then when you say, well, look, it's not just me. Here is a surgeon from America. Here is a surgeon from the United Kingdom. There is a nurse from Denmark and from Italy and so on. That brings much more confidence that at the end, this will be a successful surgery operation. And also some other points, what is also benefit, because of NATO membership, I believe, and I know some examples that the access to the technologies was possible. Without NATO membership, maybe we would not have access to some modern technologies. And of course, air policing is an example. Without NATO, we would have invested in capabilities today we don't need to. We can trade together with some other, we can use their capabilities because they will be available once we need them. And finally, NATO provides a mirror. We can live in the world that we are really okay, or one of the best. But then is a process, is a periodical survey of the capabilities. And there is a NATO team of experts and comes with a mirror, and they tell you, well, maybe you have impression that you are good, but look, here is not fine, and so on. So we have this feedback from the outside that we can really see where we are, and then we get an advice. Most of the time we ignore, but look, it is there available. It is there available, and we can adapt our way how we transform and develop military capabilities using this professional advice from NATO experts. Thank you very much.
General, you were always modest, and now I hope that you realize that when we ignored your orders, that you were not surprised, or so. We never ignored it. Now, young lady, Ms. Šinkovec, you're now State Secretary at the Ministry for Internal Affairs. You were part of MOD for a long time. We are proud of you all the time. You were part of civilian portion of MOD, deployed to Afghanistan, deployed to Kosovo, wounded in Afghanistan. And please, can you share your feelings and what NATO means to the civilian portion and as a lady as you are?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. It is a pleasure to be here with you today. I will tackle two things: building defense system and military forces, which was already elaborated by Brigadier General Forlan. And also I will speak about civil area of NATO functioning. We twice already heard today about that our Slovenian military is well trained. And of course, Mr. Brigadier Forlan told us, and I can confirm that it is truly necessary, the training and exercises. And NATO is giving us a sparring partner actually in those activities. And not only that, it's giving us information. We can share information with our allies. We have access to capacity building and capability development even. And when I was in Afghanistan, I was pretty sure that our military, especially when our base was under attack, I was sure that our military is well trained. And besides, I was also sure that they will pull me out if necessary, because they did their job with all their heart. Let me concentrate now on the civil area of NATO functioning. I have been deployed twice as a civil functional specialist in ISAF mission, and one time as a special political advisor to commander of KFOR mission in Kosovo. During my mission in Kosovo, actually I gained very valuable experiences, and that enriched my work when I came home and worked as a defense policy advisor. But during my mission in Afghanistan, a lot of people were asking me, and they were actually criticizing NATO, why NATO is doing only military actions there. And I was actually trying to prove them wrong, or I was explaining my experiences. Because as a civil functional specialist, I was part of multinational provincial reconstruction team in Herat. And our role was to engage with civil population and contribute to reconstruction and development of the province. And we did that together with local government, with non-governmental organizations, international organizations that worked in the field. For example, we did a lot of projects for local people. We did veterinarian projects to protect farm animals from diseases. We equipped universities with computers and gave actually tools to students to work with. And in many cases, we were building schools. But I heard when I came home, yeah, we are only building schools, but who is using them? Of course, we tried to build those schools with the purpose that children would go to schools, and we did that with agreeing with local government, local population. Sometimes we failed, yes, that is true, but it was part of our mission. And besides those projects, we focused also on women. NATO at some point actually realized that not enough energy was put in actually half of population in Afghanistan. So PRTs were the one that focused then on women and made projects for capacity building for women. Let me conclude with the thought: Slovenia has limited capacities when building military capabilities, but we do have capacities to build niche capabilities, and civil capabilities, in my opinion, are one of them. Thank you.
Milita, thank you very much. Always short and sweet. And believe me, they were ready to take you out. If General or myself were there, they will never be ready for us. They were ready for you. And maybe, you know, in 1990, I know when I went to a referendum, my goal was not just independent Slovenia, but Slovenia in EU and NATO. Professor Prebilic, you're also a professor, and can you tell us maybe something about the public opinion, about the young people and NATO young people and EU or our citizens dialogue between NATO and the young people or even our citizens? Please.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great honor to be here. Well, you know, before I go into details, I would like to say that we are not talking to the right people right now. You are a wonderful audience, but I believe that you are the, let's say, believers in NATO and the future within the NATO. We should talk to those guys who are not present today, and they would like to, no, they already risen in their understanding that NATO may not be the right answer. We have political parties in the parliament saying, well, maybe we should have another referendum going from NATO on our own. Well, to all those guys, I would like to say, well, this could be a very interesting issue, but before you do that, please bring us alternative, because one move would lead to another one. But when we talk about the public opinion, there is really a problem. Why? The first one is when we talk about the perception of NATO, people really do not understand the concept. I would say that we have a problem of so-called security illiteracy. People do not understand what does it really mean to share the burden or to contribute to the security issues. When we talk in the classroom to my students, and every year we have a new generation in front of us, I have to say that more and more people understand NATO as a buffet. So you have to be in. Once you're in, somebody else will do the business. So we are taken care of. Somebody else will do the job. Of course, this is the wrong perception. I would even dare to say that maybe this was the, well, it's a rooted problem in our Slovenian perception. It goes to the understanding of responsibility, who will do something and why. So I think that we do not address the right issue in Slovenia, and we heavily underestimate the civilian society. We still live in democracy, and people have a voting right. So if they don't understand the concept, well, there will be the consequences also for the decision makers, and we do have problems from the decision maker perception. Why? Because if you ask people, would you like to increase the spending for defense needs, you won't have any kind of support in Slovenia. And of course, it's not important what kind of obligations or, let's say, word are we giving to someone. We have to listen to the people. So my, let's say, plea will be, let's refocus and talk more to the society, explaining them essence of the model of collecting security, a model of burden sharing. And something is very also interesting is that younger people, younger society means that, well, the security is, well, is just there. Somebody, who is taking care about security, who does provide something, who should be trained, why, how much does it cost? This is something that we, well, especially the younger, we don't understand that. And I think we should really pay more attention to that issue. And when I talk about the responsibility, there is another thing that I would like to share with you is whenever we say, well, who will do something and why, the question will be back, and this is what I will get from that. So what will be my benefits? And again, I would dare to say we did not explain the benefits. I just had few telephone calls today regarding what are my comments on NATO, the essence, and of course what is good for Slovenia being a member of this elite club. And I tried to, to emphasize those, let's say, very good things that we can benefit from the alliance. And also the newspaper said, well, we didn't know that. So I think this is really a core problem in our society. We have to address this problem. And the question would be who? I would say, of course, not the MOD, because, well, it's an awkward position that, a defense minister will say, well, you should do that and that. Definitely not Ministry of Interior. I think we have a lot of space for improvement in the area of education. If you go to our textbooks, you will see that you don't have in any kind of textbook issue of security, who does provide it, what this is costing for, who should take part, and so on and so on. Mr. Defense Minister before drew attention to the fact we are not really in position to persuade younger people to join the army. And I think this is the core problem, because not understanding the concept, If we do not contribute, nobody will take care about us. Of course, we will be helped in certain manners, but we are the first ones to take care about the defense issues and security. And this is something I would like to raise today. And of course, going back to your homes and your functions you do, please address the society, what NATO stands for, who should do something, and why.
Professor, thank you very much. Maybe a replica, as I know you have something to add, and please.
Just I wanted to echo the point about the younger generation, because you also invited me to, and I failed to answer that. I would say two things. First of all, I think this is a challenge across the board in the alliance. This is not specific to Slovenia. This is everywhere. We need to engage the new generation of Americans, Canadians, Europeans on what does NATO stand for, what is it, why is it useful, and so on, and to sort of be part of the conversation. We've been extremely successful in certain parts of the alliance, less so in others, so it's a daily challenge. The second thing I would stress is that in targeting that younger population, let me just do exactly 30 seconds of publicity. NATO is a relatively small organization, but there are tons of internship jobs that are valuable at NATO, and we hire every year hundreds of people for short-term contracts, for visits at NATO, for internships at NATO. And I would really plead that you turn to your students, your sons and nephews, and invite them to join us, both boys and girls, because it's a fantastic opportunity to work in an environment. Essentially, the only thing you need for that is to be a citizen of a NATO country and to be skillful and smart. And then it's a demanding process to enter. But these are the only two requirements, plus a bit of security clearance. But that should not be too much of a problem if those individuals are handpicked by this room. So, having said all of this, what I'm saying here is that this organization needs also contributions from all 29 allies. And this is coming slowly. I see it for my own division. We only have about 16 nationalities represented in the Defense Investment Division. I really wish we could move to having the right diversity. We're really working on it on every case whenever we hire someone. I have a Slovenian, but I think he's a Slovenian American, so he has an American passport. But we all would benefit from having this wider diversity and this wider group. And then when those people go back to their systems as civil servants, as academics, they bring that inside knowledge of NATO, which is very, very important.
Thank you very much. Lord Robertson, you wanted to make a comment on that?
Now, my professorial colleague here is right that he's right and he's wrong in saying that this is the wrong audience. He's right because we need to address the outside audience, the younger audience. But this audience matters as well because it needs to know what Slovenia has to do, what the commitments were that your country took on when you became members of NATO. You know, when I was Secretary General, I used to have to go around like a diplomat. This went against the grain because I'd been a party politician for most of my life. But I had to be careful about what I said when I went to countries, so I was usually polite in public and sometimes quite rude in private, and telling people what their obligations were. Well, I'm not a diplomat anymore. I'm not sure whether I'm a politician anymore. But your country made commitments when you joined NATO. You made commitments at the Welsh Summit about very specific figures about what you were going to take on with all of the other countries. And Slovenia is nowhere near coming up to these commitments. And that needs to be said. The figures are quite stark. The President and the Defense Minister made the point today. But, you know, 1.5% by 2025, when the commitment was 2%. That isn't anything like what is necessary. Wales, there was an agreement by all of the countries that it would be 20% of the budget would be spent in equipment, and Slovenia is spending 8.2% on equipment. And pay for its forces accounts for 72.5% of the budget. You know, that is a pretty dreadful, lamentable case. And this audience needs to know that, that you're not living up to the obligations that the country took on when it became a member of NATO. But having said that, I was a politician, an elected politician for 21 years. And I know it's difficult in times of austerity and in times of trouble, although your country's GNP increased by 4.5% in 2018. So you're way ahead of many other countries in Europe, including mine, when it comes to generating national wealth. But you need to get over the message, and that's where the second audience is going to be required. If you're going to actually come up to the commitments that the country took on, then you need to get the message over to the population in general, and especially to the younger generation, about what NATO is about, why it matters, why national security concerns them and their families and their future generations as well. And that isn't necessarily the easiest thing to do. But we did it during the Cold War. You know, we told people why 4% was necessary to deal with the enemies that we had at that time and the threats that we faced at that time. And somehow we need to get back, you know, to making sure that people know why national security matters to them, why effective armed forces are valuable to a society, why defense is important, why freedom and its protection is important as well. This country, and there are people in this room who will remember the days of communism and what it actually meant. And there are people in this room who also know what a war is like, because you had to fight militarily for your independence at the end of Yugoslavia. So it's not as though you're in a vacuum. There is enough experience there to be able to tell the younger generation. Now, they might not, as Foreign Minister and I were talking about before, recognize what the lack of liberty and the torture chambers and the summary executions and the lack of freedom meant in a totalitarian regime. But try telling that younger generation that lives off tablets, cannot go for 5 minutes without looking at their screens, that the days of communism meant that there weren't even books, never mind screens, that there were no free telephones to allow you to communicate with your friends, that you were stifled in that kind of country, and that has not yet disappeared in the world. So we need to get over the message that NATO is not about the old Cold War. It's not about an instrument of that. It's what we did in Afghanistan, as was being said. When I used to go around, because I was there when we took on ISAF, the International Security and Assistance Force in Afghanistan, and people asked me the question, why should we send our young people across the Tora Bora Mountains, thousands of miles away? And I said, I'll tell you this. The reason is this. Either we go to Afghanistan or Afghanistan comes to us. And if anybody thinks that these threats have disappeared, then just look at what happened in this last week in New Zealand, on the other side of the world, when these forces stretched out their arms there as well. They haven't gone away. And whether it's attacks through ISIS, through cyber world, through the social media world, through the interference in elections, the threats to our free society still exist, but we need to get it over. And if I could just give a plug for NATO and its information division, not only are there internships there, NATO produces a wealth of information about what NATO does, what it has achieved, why it matters for the future. And national governments have the responsibility of disseminating that information. And it's extremely important that it gets out. I addressed a committee of the United Kingdom Parliament on Monday this week and made exactly the same point. Don't rely on websites. You know, saying it's on our website is like saying, why did you not read my speech in the House of Lords last week? it's the easy answer, but it's not the right answer. You need to get it into the hands of those who are going to be affected. So if you're going to live up to your obligations, you need to make sure that people know why these obligations matter to them.
Lord, thank you very much. It was really great spirit. Professor Prebilic, please.
I would just, emphasize one thing. You drew attention to the Cold War and so on, but I would say that our decision makers today will face tremendous challenge to present the threat today to the population and society. Why? Because if you go into the public opinion measurements, you will see that a lot of people, not even Slovenia, across Europe and other countries as well, they really do not, let's say, feel the threats as we did in, let's say, historical periods before. This is one fact, and the other one is the structure of threats changed over the time. So it's not that people today will be afraid of the open conflict or something like that. Even terrorism. Terrorism in Slovenia is on the 4th place when we talk about threat perception in Slovenia. The first problem in Slovenia, as people are asked, is the question of environmental changes. It's about food security, water security. It's the corruption. And then comes the threat of the terrorism. So I'm not saying that this is a easy job, but definitely the decision makers will have to confront the problem. Why? Because people do not understand threats as we did once in the history. So they have to be even more careful, even more responsible when approaching the public opinion or society in our country. And of course, it's not our only case of society in Slovenia. I would say this is the case also in European society as well.
Thank you. Now I promise that we will give at least 20 minutes to our audience for questions and answers. So I'm putting first question, please, if you have.
My congratulations to Slovenia and NATO on today's anniversary. And let me make one comment and one question to Lord Robertson and Mr. Grant. As you may know, just 2 days ago, Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg reiterated that NATO remains committed to open door policy, the issue you didn't mention yet, and it keeps working with 3 aspirant countries, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Georgia, and Ukraine. At the moment, it is believed that those countries have all necessary practical tools to prepare for membership, and I would like this chance and thank you, Minister, for unwavering support for our Euro-Atlantic aspirations. We actively promote Black Sea security dialogue, and Georgia remains a top per capita contributor to resolute support mission in Afghanistan. As you may know, there's ongoing unprecedented NATO-Georgia exercise now in Georgia, and we expect Secretary General to join this exercise within participation of 21 member countries and 3 non-member countries, including Georgia as a host nation. So here I have a question. Could you elaborate a little bit about what could be the perspectives of those nations to become member of alliance, and could I ask you for million-worth question, when? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe we can collect 3 questions and then we can answer 3 questions. Maybe the second question. There is no second question, then we'll answer the first question. Easy as that. So maybe Mr. Grant, yeah.
Let me start with first of all by praising Georgia as a partner. Georgia, we've been invited to be undiplomatic, contributes more to NATO operations and missions than many NATO allies, and has been a very steadfast contributor to a number of NATO activities. And for that particular reason, Georgia was recognized as what we call enhanced partners. What we mean by that, and just to make that figure clear, we're talking about 5 countries in the world when NATO is partnering with 50+ countries. So those are the closest partners that NATO has, and Georgia is one of them unequivocally. And is active not only in Afghanistan, but is volunteering to do things in Iraq with NATO, and so on and so forth. Secondly, Georgia is extraordinarily active in our activities, and there I speak from the inside of the alliance, in our day-to-day work. Many of our committee work, of our working groups are open to partners, and I can tell you once again that Georgia is very active in these groups. I have the privilege of chairing committees on standardization, on national armament directors and things like that, and the Georgian colleagues are extraordinarily present in those discussions on a daily basis. The exercise you mentioned is a further proof of that. So now moving to the difficult part, which is of course the politics of all of this. First of all, there is a very big focus on developments in the Black Sea that are related not only to the events in Georgia and to the events in Ukraine, but more broadly, which makes Georgia an all the more valuable partner in such a context. And this is something that is emphasized by the exercise, but is also emphasized by the fact that a number of allies are more active in the Black Sea region and are more active in their bilateral partnership with Georgia in this context. And everyone, we are extremely familiar with that, and it was, you know, also interesting if I look at the Brussels summit. I mean, there was one, the only session that was really open to partners was with the Ukrainian and Georgian president. So just to make that point very clear here in the sort of special nature of the partnership with Georgia and Ukraine and Bosnia-Herzegovina as aspiring partners. Coming to the open door policy, NATO allies have stated again and again that the open door policy stands, and that NATO is an organization that has an open door, and has demonstrated it in practice by integrating recently Montenegro, and now the minute the dispute between Skopje and Athens about the name was resolved, by opening the door to Northern Macedonia. So we don't only say it, we do it in practice, especially in the Western Balkans. Then, of course, the process, and you're very familiar with it, and it was stated since the Bucharest summit, is to say, okay, there are, and of course our Slovenian hosts are very familiar with that process. There are a number of criteria to be met that are related to interoperability, military, political, and this is, and Georgia has made tremendous progress in that process of moving much closer to NATO over time, and I would say over several presidents as well, which is, I think, shows the commitment of not only one party, but of the Georgian political system to this project, to this Euro-Atlantic aspiration. Then, of course, at the end game, and there are experience, there are those who experience the own Slovenian move towards NATO in the room. It becomes both a discussion within the alliance on is the timing right, when are we there, and an assessment, a very honest and somewhat brutal assessment on the readiness and of enlargement. So it's very difficult for me to say when, because that decision lies with the allies, of course. What I can say is that we are working on it every day, that Georgia is one of our really closest partners, and again, there are only 5 of those in the world, and that we praise on a very regular basis Georgia for being that close of a partner, and from having moved much closer to NATO standards in many fields over essentially a fairly short period of time.
Thank you. So Lord Robertson was right. It's the right public because they have all answers and no questions. Maybe because, okay, I'm sorry for that. And I was meant to ask something about that, but probably Ambassador, she will raise that question. Please, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. Sophie Honey, British Ambassador here in Slovenia. Firstly, thank you so much for the invitation here to help celebrate with you today. For me personally, it's very refreshing today to come to an event that doesn't have the letter B in the title. So thank you very much, and it's a great honour, I think, for all of us in the diplomatic community to celebrate this today. From my perspective, my friend and colleague Alesh Mishmash, Director General at the Ministry of Defence, has just been in the UK to talk about how we can keep building our partnership on defence and security, but we're also very glad to stand together as NATO allies. I think we've had a really interesting discussion in the roundtable here today, and Lord Robertson, it's a great pleasure to hear your perspective coming back to this field, given your time as NATO Secretary General, and it's very interesting to hear your perspective, very frank perspective, around the question of living up to commitments in NATO, and also about how to generate that sort of discussion within the public about the need to value and contribute to our security. I was really interested in what you said about thinking back to the past and the values that NATO brings, and I think that you talked about thinking back to the days of communism, and I think actually that the experience of Slovenia as part of former Yugoslavia is very, very different to the experience of current NATO members who were formerly behind the Iron Curtain, and I think it's very, very different, and so the sort of contrast with NATO it's not so clear cut. So I was really just interested in hearing perhaps the perspective of one of the Slovene panelists on the points that you were making about what NATO brings in that regard, and how to have that debate with younger people, because I think it's an entirely different debate than might be had in other NATO partners who were formerly behind the Iron Curtain. Thank you.
This is called buck passing problems, I'm just joking. So, yes, but when you talk to Slovenian understanding of or experience that we had being a member of, let's say, Eastern Bloc, of course I have to amend that fact to that Yugoslavia was something else, wasn't really the hard communism as somebody could understand that. But nevertheless, when we talk about Slovenian experience, I have to say that we have now new generations who already were born into independent Slovenia. Having that said, when we talk about, for example, Yugoslavia, younger people don't even know that Yugoslavia existed, that there was a President Tito, that there was a really not, let's say, pluralistic or even dictatorship regime, and so on and so on. I would say that really times heals the wounds really quickly when talking about these facts. So if we would like to emphasize more on the values of NATO, we have to bring more history, of course, but also some other things as human rights, democracy, working states, and of course showing cases, not maybe from our perspective, or let's say from our historical perspective, but regional perspective. So what happened, for example, in Bosnia and Herzegovina and so on. So these could be great, in quotation mark, of course, not understand me right, cases. What can happen if we fail, and how much of effort, energy, and so on is needed to correct these things then afterwards or repair to a certain point. So as I said before, I think that there is a lot of room for improvement when we talk about the education, awareness, and as Lord Robertson said before, we have to bring this more oftenly, because everything today is really taken for granted. We understand that this is just here because it is, and somebody else will provide what we need. And I think this is the wrong attitude. I don't know how it's in your countries, but I'm really close to younger generations, lecturing to the pupils. And what can I say is that this responsibility problems already starts in the primary school. For example, I have a daughter in primary school, and when she comes from school, she said, well, I was studying hard, but something happened. And I said, what? Well, the professor asked me the wrong question. I said, maybe you did not study enough. No, it is a professor problem. It's not my problem. So I don't know how is this working in your countries, but we have problems with the responsibility among the population. So we do not understand that for every action we need to take something from ourselves, starting with us, not with the others, but us. And this is the essence of NATO. So everything starts with the nations. everything with the states, then we will share the burden. And I think this could be more elaborated in everyday communication to the people.
I better say to Ambassador Honey that I've never ever made the mistake of conflating Yugoslavia with the communist world. Maybe some other people have, but I don't think I've ever done that. But it's certainly, you know, Yugoslavia managed to sort of straddle it, but it was not free. And the legacy afterward was a pretty dreadful one, which the rest of the world then had to pick up. You know, I tell the story about the 1997 general election in Britain when Tony Blair won the election. I became Defense Secretary. But during that campaign, there was this incredible atmosphere. The weather was beautiful for a start, which was unusual. I was the leader of the Scottish Labour Party. I came to a housing estate near Edinburgh, bounced out of my campaign bus. You know, there's a large number of people sitting there on the wall enjoying the sunshine. So as politicians do, you bounce out, a big smile, hello, how are you today? This is a wonderful day. Hope you're all going to vote Labour. And they said, no. I said, come on, this is ridiculous. I said, you know, you're not going to vote Labour? Everybody's voting Labour. And they said, no, we're not voting Labour. And I said, well, why not? They said, we come from Banja Luka. And it then sort of focused, you know, the mind at that time that the Balkan issue was not simply a matter for the Balkans. You know, the spillover was coming way beyond the borders of an area as well. And I think that is where a lot of the security issues, you know, when I was in NATO, we had not contemplated the idea of the mass migration across the Mediterranean Sea. I know Ambassador Shinkots had predicted it, but he was one of the very few people who recognized that that was going to be one of the big security threats, and it's not one that has gone away today. So we have to be able to predict these things and bring on side a public, and especially a younger public, to recognize that collective defense is cheaper than national defense.
Thank you. Do we have a third question maybe? No? Okay, maybe then I promised I won't say B, but what the divorce in one family means for next family. Let's say divorce in EU family. I'm also responsible for EU matters, and what that can mean also for getting closer or getting more cooperation in the NATO family, let's say. So I'm talking about the B word that I cannot pronounce. Maybe Lord? And
I don't know the answer to that. I think we're living in a world where normality has changed. This audience, as you said rightly, you know, we've become used to the world as it is, and the improvements that have taken place. We are extraordinarily lucky to be alive in this world today. This world is more at peace than it has ever been in its history before. We are freer, better governed internationally. We are better fed. There is less poverty. There is more prosperity. We're better sheltered, better educated in the world today than ever before in history. So we are extremely lucky to be alive. And yet there is a restiveness among populations, questioning what we've taken for granted. And therefore, we've got an obligation to try and tell people how it is we got to where we are today, how precious it is, and how we need to invest in the future. And, you know, in the United Kingdom, we asked a stupid question and we got a stupid answer. And now the political class is desperately trying to deal with that. It's not doing it very well. I speak for my party as well as for the governing party at the present moment, but it's a salutary lesson to other people about how you can take things for granted, that the elites can simply assume that what we regard as normal and accepted is going to be accepted by everybody else. And therefore what we've said about educating the population and the younger population applies on a wider spread basis as well. So it's a warning to all of us that the unity of nations and the unity between nations in a complicated, interdependent world matters really severely. And I think that there are a number of countries inside the European Union at the present moment who, up until the British referendum, may well have contemplated the idea of coming out or having a referendum about coming out. I think our experience may well have destroyed that, and in that respect, we've done a favor to the rest of Europe.
Thank you very much. Mr. Grant?
Maybe just, again, a bit of the inside perspective on where, first of all, I think one thing that is absolutely clear, and it's obviously clear in a NATO environment, is that the UK is committed to European security in whatever form it takes, and that is quite clear in a NATO environment. Probably there is even as much or more influence of our British colleagues in the NATO system since the days of Lord Robertson. Currently, the chairman of the military committee is a British officer. There is a very, very strong commitment in the NATO environment that is there, and our anniversary event at the leaders level will take place in London at the end of this year. Having said that, of course, the second thing you learn from inside NATO is that when it comes to the allies, NATO is not a debate between the EU and the United States. There are a number of allies that are neither Americans or EU member states. Canada, which is often forgotten when we discuss the transatlantic ties. Norway, who provides the Secretary General. Turkey, obviously, I mean, a very important ally. Montenegro, Albania, Iceland. So it is an organization which, from that perspective, you know, the notion of the European pillar of the alliance goes beyond the EU there. Having said this, we have to really, there is, I think, a third element to this conversation, which is to recognize that as the EU evolves, we at NATO need to work more and more with the European Union. Because the involvement of EU in defense matters, which I tend to perceive, and we at NATO tend to perceive as a good news altogether, because it can bring more capabilities, more effort, and if done in a sort of in a good spirit of cooperation, it can even contribute to burden sharing. But that needs all of those EU allies and those non-EU allies to really be able to work together and to have a very honest conversation about how those two organizations can work together. This has been happening since the Warsaw Summit with a number of proposals that are there. We have more engagements with EU in the last 2 years. The PermRep would recognize that we have EU speakers in the NAC room literally every other month or every month. Commissioners, Julian King was there last week. We have had, of course, the High Representative Mogherini at literally every ministerial in the room. We also have the commissioners for investment, Commissioner Binkowska, and Vice President of the Commission Katainen coming. So it's really a flow of engagement, and vice versa. The Secretary General is attending every EU ministerial foreign affairs or defense, has been at EU councils. So this now needs to translate into the sort of practical world, and to, as you know, sort of go to the very working level so that we can produce together that in full respect for each organization's identity. But I think it is there, and this is critically important for those allies who are not EU member states, or who unfortunately are likely to become non-EU member states.
Thank you, Ambassador Szynkowicz. Now we have a lot of discussion regarding the EU military and EU army. How do you see relationship between the EU military in case of that we'll have it, and NATO?
Sorry, this is I still have my minister here, so I'm afraid to say something that he might not want to hear. But no, I mentioned that I'm a sort of bit of a skeptic about sort of future, at some point, defense union. And I've been watching the relationship between the EU and NATO for, quite a long time. And I use the word, it's still pathetic, the relationship. Yes, it's people visit each other, they go here and there, but really down on the ground, it's not really happening. What I have hoped for would be that actually the two organizations, when they're faced with crisis somewhere in the Euro-Atlantic area, they would have common assessment, perhaps a common strategy, hopefully division of labor, coordination, but probably we'll have to wait for another 10 or 20 years to have something like that. But let's work on it. I think it's very good that the PSC, the EU and the NAC meet now and then. Sometimes it takes 2 years for them to meet. Sometimes they manage to meet twice in 2 weeks. I wish this would continue and be much more on a regular basis. So I do have hopes, but I'm not ecstatic about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Mišinković, maybe how the institutions in Slovenia or maybe around the world are engaged in NATO environment, let's say so, or it's in Slovenia just MOD, it belongs to NATO, or it's something else, and what we should do on that matter.
Yeah, thank you very much. I know much more about when NATO is in the mission or when is functioning out of the European territory. And saying from my experiences, I would say that NATO became better when cooperating with different international organizations in the field, in the missions. But what I was missing when I was working in NATO mission, in ISAF especially, I saw a lot of international organizations working actually the same things. There was a lack of coordination among them. There was a lack of sharing information among them. So we were actually duplicating our actions. And I missed more coordination among that. When I was working in Kosovo, actually from the, let's say, from tactical level to a little bit higher strategic level, I saw that commanders were actually trying to engage and share information with local government, with NGOs, IOs that were working there. But then I was thinking, what is in between? So strategic level is doing something, but on tactical level you don't see that. So there should be maybe also at NATO when NATO is planning the mission, they should probably think more how to connect those dots. Thank you.
Thank you. And almost at the end, and maybe General Forlan, maybe just give us a brief overview. 10 years ago, a lot of was happening in the military. We achieved a lot of new standards regarding the NATO, and maybe give us the final thoughts, and then we will end with the final thoughts with our panelists. Please.
Okay, thank you very much. So once we finish this, there is a glass of wine waiting there, and it's a lot of reasons that we can raise a glass to NATO, to alliance, to all nations, and of course Slovenia, that we embarked 15 years ago on this journey, and was really exciting, and I'm glad to meet a lot of you that have been involved in the process. But then from the military perspective, we would put on the title not just NATO and Slovenia 70 and 15, we would add and 10. Because once Slovenia joined NATO, it's the start of integration of Slovenian armed forces. The process started in 2004 and finished formally at the end of 2009. So for us, it's 10 years now from when we formally proved that we are able and ready to conduct NATO operations, we are interoperable, and the process of adopting doctrine, procedures, enhancing NATO operations, providing for NATO response force, developed certain capabilities declared for NATO operations. At that time, you remember, Role 2 Medical Unit, NBCR Battalion, and so on. So it was a really demanding process. And we have many reasons today and during this year to raise another glass and to be proud of this process. And maybe for the last, some thoughts. A wise man once said that democracy is really not a perfect political system, but so far no one has invented better. We can argue, or we can discuss whether NATO is perfect organization to discuss security matters, because you have a lot of organizations you can do this. But NATO is, let's say, proven in reality. It has a power to change things, and this is different from other organizations. Just picture this, that one day one nation really close the Hormuz Strait, and we will be all upset because it influenced the economy of all of us. And there will be discussion in the United Nations, in the European Union, and of course in NATO. If 29 NATO nations decide to open this strait, can do and destroy the whole navy that jeopardize traffic through this strait. So this is what matters, and this is what is all about the NATO, the power. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mishinkovec, maybe last thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. I would like to bring forward actually the principle of NATO. NATO is bringing together former adversaries that were adversaries in the past, but now NATO accomplished that those former adversaries are at the same table together, speaking, discussing. And for Slovenia, Slovenia is actually a member country, and all the preconditions are met, are fulfilled, that Slovenia can influence and form decision according to its interests. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just first of all, I mean, the key message about this alliance is, and since this is the week of francophonie, I'll say it in French because this comes from D'Artagnan, un pour tous, tous pour un. One for all for one. And this is something that we tend to really forget sometimes when we have a selfish approach and a sort of a free-riding approach to this alliance. We are in a very demanding security environment. I'm not playing with fears, I'm just looking at facts. Of course, depending on where we sit in Europe, it looks bad or worse. But this is the reality of our security environment today. And this is something that really requires our investment into NATO, requires our investment into defense. We don't do it because, you know, of course, the commitment matters. We don't do it for the commitment, we do it for our own security, and I think this is really important. And the last thought I would leave you with, because since we're approaching a new enlargement this year, is that I can see, for having worked at NATO over the last 15 years, how much enlargement has brought to the alliance and how much the alliance has brought to the new members. And I think this is something that I really would like to stress at this stage. Thank you.
Thank you. Two things, not just one. First, relevance of NATO has been discussed for decades. It reminds me of the questions, if the Rolling Stones in their 70s are still relevant today. I think both the Rolling Stones and NATO are relevant. Secondly, I want to use this opportunity actually to acknowledge what Lord Robertson and the British Labour government did for us a long time ago in 1997. Namely, Defense Secretary George Robertson and Foreign Secretary Robin Cook proposed to include Slovenia on the list of invitees to NATO. And instead of a small enlargement with Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary, it would be a smallish enlargement, 3+1. Ambassador, where is he? I can't see him. My then deputy, who's been ambassador then for a long time, Boža Cera, would remember that. But unfortunately, the US did not agree with it, so it did not go forward. Thank you.
Well, speaking about security is like having your house insured. You know, we all complain how difficult it is to raise money to insure your house. But, you know, we all hope that we won't need this insurance. But if you will need it, you will be taken care of. It's about security as well. So whenever we talk about contribution for security, you cannot have it if you do not contribute. Of course, if you have friends who will contribute with you, who share values and who have reference lists that we can really rely on, this could be only benefit for us as well. So since we have some quotes here, in Roman time there was a quote, viribus unitis, and this is also the way how we can enhance our security in Europe. Thank you.
Well, I would just like to say that the accession of Slovenia to NATO was not simply the function of foreign ministers and prime ministers at the time. It involved, as Ambassador Shinkos has said, a whole series of people in the back rooms, in the military and in others, you know, getting the country ready to be part of one of the world's elite organizations that has contributed not just to the defense of Slovenia, but the prosperity of Slovenia as well. Membership of NATO is a very significant economic driver, as most of the countries who joined NATO have actually found. So I would pay a tribute to all of those, you know, before and during the accession process who brought Slovenia to the point of being a full member of the NATO family as well. And I'd also say that this question of insurance is the important one to get across to people when we don't know what the future is going to be. In my country, I don't even know what's likely to happen this afternoon. But we don't know what the security challenges are going to be, and yet we need to have a portfolio of assets, diplomatic as well as military, in order to be able to deal with it. You know, if the public in New Zealand 2 weeks ago had been asked to put terrorism, right-wing terrorism, at the top of their list, it would have been way down near the bottom. But it's not anymore. If the United States of America on the 10th of September 2001 had been told there was the likelihood of a massive terrorist attack on business buildings in New York, would anybody have contemplated that possibility? And on the 11th of September, we knew what the reality was. If people in Estonia had thought that a cyber attack that would have taken down critical national infrastructure was a possibility, they might have said that that was one of the remote possibilities. So these things happen. On the radio this morning, I heard the reports that were coming from East Africa, in Malawi and in Mozambique and in Zimbabwe. And I heard the report brought music to my ears, and it said the air was filled with a buzzing of military helicopters taking aid to the people in trouble. And it brought back to my mind my lectures to defense ministers in NATO countries to say, do not assume that this is only the business of the Ministry of Defense. Go to the Minister of the Interior, go to the Ministry of International Development, because they will use your capabilities probably more than you ever will do in the military context as well. So countries and politicians who lead those countries have got a responsibility not for just dealing with today's public opinion, but molding tomorrow's public opinion as well. And that is what people did in Slovenia in the years leading up to the accession, to the years leading up to the referendum that produced a 66% return in this country for it. And I remember coming down here and addressing the Parliament of Slovenia, trying not to interfere in the local politics, because that would have been improper, but getting as close to it as damn it, to reminding people about what was happening there as well. So your country has done well as a full member of the alliance. It needs to do more in the future. But anchored in the alliance, you've given the people of this country something very very special indeed, and they need to know about it and why it continues to be important. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm convinced, like 1990, the NATO is the right bet. Now I propose that we go out and raise our glasses and have a toast to NATO and a bright future in front of us. And again, please, a round of applause for the panelists. Thank you very much.